Hey everybody, and welcome to this video explanation of a real classic chess game, Larsen Spassky, one of the most brutal and one-sided beatdowns of any of the games to memorize that we have in the dojo curriculum. For those of you watching this video, this is probably your video to memorize, your game to memorize. So an advantage is the game is fairly short, so you should be feeling very confident that you can do this one. In general, the greatest games of chess, in my opinion, usually have some back and forth and some resistance. But every now and then, a beatdown is just so scintillating and sparkling and electrifying that that it is worthy of study and just very edifying to enjoy, even if one of the players is basically just a punching bag within the story of that particular game. All right, so here we have Larsen versus Spassky. This game was actually played in a match in 1970 that was called the USSR versus the world. The Soviet school of chess is now not quite what it used to be, but there was a time when the Soviets were so good at chess that one country's chess players could conceivably defeat the entire rest of the world. Okay, so this is from that famous match. Imagine one country playing a match against the entire rest of the world now. It would be very hard to imagine, right? It would be an absolute beatdown by the world, no matter what country you picked. Because chess has been so democratized and widespread around the world right now. All right, so let's get into this game. Larsen plays the Larsen opening. He plays b3. Okay, Spassky is going to play very classically. He's going to block. He's going to just develop all his pieces straight into the center of the board, folks. Okay, nothing fancy or hypermodern about what Spassky does here. Just good, clean moves. The point of b3 is to play bishop b2, set the bishop up on a great square to pressure the center. The bishop's nicely housed inside these pawns, can't be disturbed. Long range, beautiful. Now, let me just say that on this move, for black, whether you play d5 or e5, just two of the main options, leads to a completely different style of game, right? If you play d5, you're basically conceding to white this diagonal, but claiming that you've got control of these light squares, and you sort of split who controls what side of the board. It leads to more of a setup and maneuvering opening versus a fighting opening. Does that make sense? Whereas e5, contesting exactly what white wants and then trying to block white's bishop by defending the pawn, which you can also play f6 or d6 here, trying to set up a rock to block the bishop. That's often going to lead to more of a fighting opening because you're trying to take what your opponent wants. So you're contesting a square, you're fighting over e5 from move 2. Now, of course, at every move, the players are going to have some choices whether they want to keep moving a game towards a fighting opening or a maneuvering opening, right? Like white could say, sure, you got e5, I'm not going to fight you for it. And white could switch to e4, knight c3, bishop c4, and try and clamp down on light squares while letting black peacefully take the dark squares with bishop c5 and d6. But a lot of the times you're going to see white fight against this pawn, you know, whether it be with f4 or with knight f3 or with d4, and we're going to have a real battle on our hands, right? Okay, so that's the start. We get the Larsen opening and black defends e5. Now, normally in this position, in my experience, the most white players I've seen have played e3, followed by bishop b5, going after this knight on c6 in order to pressure the e5 pawn by potentially removing its defender. That's what I've seen the most often. But Larsen here plays the move c4. And now that's kind of like a reversed Sicilian, right? Where the bishop's been placed on a nice square to pressure this pawn. And it should be fine, but the plan he's going to use this game doesn't really work together for me. So he starts with c4. It cuts off d5, right? So it keeps black from taking over the center. That's his next step. Spassky is just going to, every chance he gets, he's going to play a plain, simple developing move, folks, okay? So if you're playing over this game in the future and you're like, oh, I forget what Spassky did, he probably played the most classical, clean, central developing move you can imagine, if you want to guess what move he did when you've forgotten, okay? So knight to f6. Now, here, a classical way to play a Sicilian, right? If white just says like, oh yeah, it's like I'm playing a Sicilian, would be to play g3, bishop g2 like a dragon, or to play d3, knight f3, fighting the pawn, but first stopping e4. The d3 pawn controls the e4 square. This is going to be a little bit riskier with b3, bishop b2 played so early in the opening. But that's possible. You can also play sort of an e3 Sicilian along with this bishop here. You could go e3, bishop e2, d3, knight f3 as well. Kind of Scheveningen style there. There's some options. But what Larsen does is he plays knight f3, kind of like a Nimzovich Sicilian, provocative, attacking the pawn, and probably, you know, giving it an option to move forward and kick the knight. The idea here is that c4 is going to cut off the reinforcement of the pawn, right? So he provokes the pawn forward by attacking it. Spassky advances the pawn, and then he moves his knight into the center. Generally, this move is going to be terrible if you have to go back to g1 or something like that, and acceptable if you can move into a central square. Okay, so he moves into a central square. And now you can see this bishop, its scope has become amazing, and this advanced pawn has been cut off from this pawn. So far, I would say, just on the surface, Larsen's opening makes some kind of sense, right? It makes some kind of sense, right? The bishop has become well placed. He's provoking the center, but it's not a very solid, well-defended pawns next to each other, controlling all the space kind of center. There's room for Larsen's pieces to play around it and try and undermine it. And now Spassky, again, plays just like a clean developing move. He says, who cares about the possible doubled pawns or whatever? Let's just bring out a new piece every move. Okay, and here he's going to get slightly ahead in development off of the back of this move. Notice white's played one pawn move that wasn't a piece developing move. And now he plays here with a tempo on the knight, and if the knight retreats, you see that black's got an extra piece out and can castle and get nicely ahead in development. I think looking at this position here that an interesting move for white developmentally would be e3. That would be the move that holds your position in the center and is trying to develop. The issue with that move to me would be for black to maybe take like this and then play d5, blocking this bishop. And although white's got the bishop pair here, it's going to be a little bit weird to use the b2 bishop. It seems almost like it has to go to a3 to ever have a future, and like that's usually going to sacrifice the d4 pawn. So this would be a very interesting, controversial variation from both players that would lead to a fighting opening, right? I mentioned between like fighting openings and maneuvering openings. Here, very, very big commitments right away. And it's because because this variation that I gave has the players playing very combative moves, right? E3 refusing to concede the tempo or the square, right? And then bishop takes d4, trying to take advantage of it to give white a positional problem. Very, very interesting and controversial. Otherwise, I think that the move white plays is perfectly natural. The knight's attacked, so white trades it to continue about their business. And Spassky takes away from the center in order to cleanly develop this bishop faster. And now you'll see, if you count the tempi, that black has gotten a little bit ahead in development. How many moves would it take black to have the rooks see each other? And how many moves for white? You can try and count that now, right? So let's count for black because it's faster and easier. Okay? I've got a number. You have a number? We can compare now. It would take black 3 more moves for the rooks to see each other. A bishop move, a queen move, and castling to either side. And then the rooks will see each other. So black's 3 moves from the rooks seeing each other. White is 1, 2, a pawn move, 3, 4, 5. 5 moves away. Okay? So Black is 2 moves ahead in development. They've just moved, so it's white's turn, so it's 1.5, but white started out half a tempo ahead in development. So black has gained 2 moves of development in just 6 moves of this game. That's right, in 6 moves, black has pulled 2 moves ahead. So that's a very, very notable factor that black's development is getting ahead of white's here. And that's going to mean that despite the great bishop and the slightly isolated pawn, black's position should be acceptable. They should be able to use that development, use the speed of putting their rooks on the E and D files to get a perfectly good position. I also have a little chess theory. Let's see, what rating band are you in? Is this too advanced to mention to you all? No. You can hear this theory. I have a theory that when there are no pawns traded, the first doubled pawn is often favorable to the side with the doubled pawn because they'll be the only side with a file for their rooks. So here that would be the D file for black. That may be too abstract for a lot of people to understand that sentence till I say, look at the board, there's only going to be one player who can put their rook on a square where it has any scope. And that's going to be black putting a rook on the D file. I think that's a very, very notable positional factor. When there's no pawn trades especially, your rook can be so much better on D8 than any of the opponent's rooks that don't have a file. When there are also open files on the board, it's less of a big deal. Obviously, getting doubled pawns always gives you like an open file as compensation, as some kind of countervailing plus. But if you're the only one with a file for the rooks, that file is worth more. It's kind of supply and demand as well, right? Like if there's 4 open files, no one of those files is as critical. When you've got the exchange French defense or something like that, the E file is super critical. You just got to put your rooks there. It's not like a tricky choice. Okay, so now Larsen plays E3 to block this bishop scope a little bit and just put this bishop here. It's a big choice whether instead you want to put the bishop on G2 to attack the E4 pawn. Normally you would want to pressure the E4 pawn. But here, when Larsen plays this move, he's basically saying he doesn't think he can win the E4 square. G3, bishop G2 would be trying to win the E4 square, but it's also, folks, a very controversial and important decision. Boom, defending it, right? Attacking it, castles, attacking it, defending it. Okay. It's super, super important because if white doesn't manage to put enough pressure on E4, the bishop on G2 is going to be a bad piece. If white does manage to put enough pressure on E4, they're basically going to win the pawn or extract some kind of huge concession from black as the pawn starts creaking. Okay? So if you're white here and you think that you can encircle this pawn and attack it more times than black can defend it since they don't have D5 or F5 coming with pawns, then you should play G3. You should put that maximum pressure on your opponent. But if you see that your opponent can solidly defend the pawn and you don't think the pressure is enough, then don't go get your bishop stuck on G2 where it'll end up being on a bad square later. Larsen did not believe in his ability to pressure this pawn, which speaks a little badly of his opening, right? That here he's just playing E3 and not fighting that pawn. If you're not going to be able to beat this pawn, then the idea of sort of separating it with the C pawn, the C4 move's not so useful in the resulting position, so one of our moves has become a lost move. And we should be strongly looking at some option to play D3 or something and just trade off the pawn if we don't think we can break it. Okay, but he plays E3. It's a mildly bad sign for him. Now in this position, I sometimes struggle to remember which order Spassky played bishop F5 and Queen E7 in. But I would say if you forget that one detail, it's not really a big deal. I think he developed the bishop first. Okay, score sheet says I'm right. But if your memory is that the game goes, Queen E7, bishop E2 is the wrong mover because white played Queen C2, bishop F5, Queen C2. If you get these 2 moves and these 2 moves mixed up, it shouldn't change what you learn about this game at all, or your ability to show this game to somebody else or explain it or talk about it or think about it. Okay, so as long as you reach this position here, this is how the game continues. So from this position, the next two moves from black are going to be developing the bishop and queen, and from white, developing the bishop and queen. Okay, so that's what I will say about this next phase and memorizing it. It doesn't matter if you know the right move order or not, but the move order is that Spassky played bishop f5 over protecting the e-pawn. Larsen plays queen c2, starting to threaten the pawn and possibly prepare queenside castling. Queen e7 over protecting the pawn, and bishop e2 continuing slightly feeble development. Slightly feeble development. And Blauschwaber asking a question that is relevant, and I addressed it slightly about e3. Isn't it logical to block the bishop? Well, I said that immediately. Yes, e3 logically reduces the scope of this bishop. But most moves in chess have like a good part and a bad part. The ideas are complicated and have many facets, right? Like when you play e3, you block this bishop and you weaken the d3 square. So whether e3 is a good or bad move depends on which of those factors is more important. It also depends on comparison. And what I've tried to do is compare e3 and g3 and tell you about the pluses and minuses of those two moves and which one does Larsen really want to play and what does it tell us about the position. I think having provoked this pawn forward and played c4 to separate it from an ally, that the consistent approach from Larsen would have been g3, bishop g2, queen c2, knight c3, trying to encircle and win this pawn. Maybe right before you play knight c3, you play bishop takes f6 to deprive it of a defender, and after queen f6, you play knight c3, and then you try and win that pawn. I think that would be the most consistent, and it would be the approach that would sort of justify, in a sense, everything Larsen's done up to this point, and would be sort of this the strategic big picture where you would say, oh, I see what white did there. Wow, that's deep. He really put a lot of pressure on black and, you know, led black into a tricky strategical pitfall, right? That's not what he did here. And so there's nothing, it's not that e3 is a bad move, but to me, e3 is a sign that white's not going to get an advantage out of this opening. If white's not pressuring this e4 pawn, then I think black has rapid development, the only file for the rooks at the moment, a good amount of space in the center, basically no problems. We don't have a way of arguing that the opening went well for white if what we're playing here is e3. Like, what would be the story, the concept, the big picture that we would tell as white to explain why we are outplaying black and why we now have an advantage? I can't think of it. I can't think of, with e3, the explanation of how white is gaining the advantage and putting pressure on black. I see no real dangers or risks or problems from the black side of this position. Okay? So bishop f5, always the cleanest central developing move from Spassky. He knows he still needs to overprotect e4, like Nimzovich said, even if white's not going for g3, bishop g2. It's good to get this pawn well defended. It's critical to his position. He wants to restrain d3 and f3 from white because white in many cases will want to break out against that space. The bishop's well placed here so that if white plays d3 or f3, when this pawn is traded, the bishop will become amazing immediately. It may even be strong enough to prevent white from playing this move, right? So he plays bishop f5, just very, very clean development. Larsen plays queen c2 before bishop e2 because he's perhaps correctly thinking about maybe playing knight c3 and castling queenside instead of kingside. Queen e7 is played, and here he plays bishop e2. And in general, it's already an important question to ask ourselves where we think the players should or would castle. Spassky is probably going to castle queenside where this bishop doesn't aim at his king. That's going to give him some more freedom with the knight and the g-pawn. The king's going to be pretty well tucked and safe here behind these four pawns, right? And it's going to bring a rook to a central file in one move. Whereas if you castle kingside, you're going to need two moves to put your rooks on d8 and e8. So he's likely to castle queenside. What about white from white's perspective? From white's perspective, if you castle opposite sides, and we'll talk a little more about this in the next couple of moves. If you castle opposite sides to the king side, black has a space advantage from the e-pawn. And because you're opposite side castling, black can throw stuff at you. And given that black's got the stronger center, if I were white, I would not want to complicate things and give black a license to throw stuff at my king. So I would rather castle to the same side as black, if I were white here, kind of castle whichever direction black goes to keep the game less tactical and complicated. Now, if black castled kingside for some reason, I would again probably follow black and castle kingside here because I don't want to castle queenside and give black license to just throw every pawn. I'm feeling slightly on the back foot as white here. You can detect that. Now, the position may not be that grim for white, but I'm feeling like I'm slightly worse and that castling to an opposite side for white is going to exacerbate that by letting black play more aggressively and tactically. That's going to sort of show more of their advantage in central maneuverability and space for their pieces. Okay, so for white, I would strongly consider knight c3 as the move order here, looking to castle queenside instead. But we're going to mainly stop on the next move and examine white's options there. So bishop e2 was played. Spassky castles. And in this position, I want to take a moment to talk about what Larsen could have done, because the move played in the game was egregious. Larsen played f4 here. Gaining space on the king side. As I said, it's kind of an egregious move, so it's a little bit hard to explain. A tactical point is you can't take en passant because queen takes bishop is check. Black would love to take en passant, by the way, and just open up these files and kill white. Honestly, black would be happy to give up the e-pawn by this point because their development lead is so nice. But you can't take en passant, so okay, the pawn gets here safely. But this move is very, very bad because it's not developing. It's not getting the king castled queenside where I think the king needs to go. So what should white do in this position? Well, I think knight c3 followed by castling queenside. To me, that's the natural idea here. To just get your king castled over the queenside, tuck it away on b1, which is the safest square for it, and then look if you can engineer b3 or f3 from there, or if you can sit tight, or if you can harass this bishop. Sometimes with knight a4, you could go after this bishop, try and simplify the position with a trade, and reopen up your bishop, clarify the position, maybe even put your queen on c3 and really pile up on that diagonal. That's what I would do. I think that's the simple approach. Knight c3. I checked whether knight g4, trying to prevent castling with knight f2, would be a problem for white. If black had something amazing to play, it would probably be knight g4. And white can respond with h3. And now the knight could sack on e3 or f2, but I'm not convinced by any of these sacrifices. So if the knight sacks this way, we can take here, not allowing queen h4. And now we can't castle queenside, but we are up a piece, and black doesn't really have an attack. So rook d1 and just starting to trade rooks would be sufficient here for white. Knight f2, king f2 is a little bit more interesting for black because it does really misplace white's king long term. And you know, I showed this position to a computer engine, not a strong one, but I just put it in a computer engine out of interest after looking at it for a bit. And interestingly, that computer engine said it was +1 for white, not +2 like you might expect. Knight for pawn sacrifice should be about a 2-pawn material sacrifice. So this is almost plausible to just randomly throw the knight at f2. It's not a completely stupid idea because the king is badly placed, black's got control of the center, and it's hard to organize white's pieces. But it's probably not advantageous for black. It's probably not so good that like black's killing white just randomly down a piece. But it's slightly interesting. But more likely, you know, white can chase the knight back and get castles to the queen side and things would be okay. So this is the move where the game goes off the rails for Larsen because he should be just tucking the king on the queen side. Instead, he grabs space on the king side, perhaps thinking that then he'll castle king side and the extra space on the king side will make it safer and better to castle king side. But, you know, this is also a hook where black can open the g file. So I'm not sure that I even follow that. But let me just show you another possibility for white, which is to simply castle king side. And I think a lot of people at first blush would not understand why it's such a big deal to castle to the opposite side in a position where black's got the stronger center. But this really allows black to just start attacking the white king. We're just going to start teeing off, right? You're going to rush this pawn. my primary plan here as black is to go h4, h3, threatening to open the h file. And when white plays h3, then I will play bishop g4, trade the bishops, and open up the f3 and g2 squares. And then there's all kinds of attacking ideas that become open because white's king, it's back rank mated forever. It's got to watch out for queen f3 to g2 forever. Nothing can move on that side of the board. The light squares are permanently weak. Black can put a rook on d3 even. So that kind of a position, and maybe I should put some more moves on the board to show you what that might look like. Like here, 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 something like that. Now bishop g4 here, probably not great because of takes, queen takes e4. Right? But I just want to put the position on the board to make it easier for you to visualize what we're talking about. Okay? We're talking about in a position like this, that this structure is brittle for white. They always have to watch out for queen f6 to f3 or queen to e6 to f5 to f3. Black can set up the rook on d3. All the light squares are weak. The knight could come to f3 or d3. Positionally speaking, this is going to be kind of a horror. So that's going to be black's plan at this point, is to play bishop here. The next move might be something to deal with the b4 threat, or it might be, rook e8, backing up this pawn, or it might even be rook d3, just going into the light squares, saying, by now with this pawn here, you can't take an exchange sack like this because you're too weak on the light squares. So I don't know exactly, the details of all the variations, how black's going to play this out with rook e8 and stuff, but that's like a first idea for black once white castles, is to rush this pawn to h3 and weaken all the light squares. That's just one idea. So here's one variation that I gave, was f3, trying to gain space for white on the king side, still with this idea here. And then I calmly play h4 for black. White takes. Look at that black bishop well placed on e4. Captures here. Queen drops back to c1. And now there's multiple good continuations. I thought rook h6 to g6 would be really nice. The point of rook h6 to g6 is we make white play bishop f3. We trade and bring the knight into e4. White can't play g3 because of the h-pawn trading, and we've already found a good target on g2 to pressure. But apparently also strong for black is this very blah idea. You just play h3 anyway, plunk the bishop here. This has to go somewhere, right? Knight comes in, and by now you can see black's ready to sack the knight on d2 and play bishop e3 checkmate, or play knight takes g3, pawn takes g3, h2, h1 in some cases. Like, oh my gosh. This is dramatically terrible for white already. Yeah, another option for white, as somebody's mentioning, is we could just play a simple development move, and once this pawn comes here, play h3 to prevent black from weakening our light squares, right? So the other piece of the h5, h4 idea is that if white stops you from getting to h3 and weakening their light squares, they create a hook on h3. And as soon as there's a hook on h3, our plan is g5, g4, opening the g file. And that, you can see, is going to be very quickly a very powerful attack for black, way before white gets anything going against black's king that's hidden behind 4 pawns. So this is how black's able to increase the intensity and the violence of the game, is because white put the king on the opposite side. That gives you the option to just start throwing stuff at white, making threats. The game gets super complex and violent, and that's how you take advantage of your space advantage in the center. So white hands that to black when they put the king on the opposite side. Therefore, I'm quite convinced that Larsen should have played with knight c3 and castles queenside to reduce the intensity of the game. Buckle up and buckle down and try to later play d3 or f3 and trade this pawn in the center. Go for a simpler positional game where white is still perfectly able to defend their position. f4 is played in the game. And, yeah, here Spassky immediately uncorks an aggressive move. You'll notice that up to here, Spassky has moved no piece twice, wasted no move on a side pawn, right? The only pawns he's moved were the 2 center pawns that let the bishops out, right? We're 10 moves in. Spassky has played just the most straightforward, straight up, develop, center move, every single move up till now, okay? But as soon as white plays this weakening f4 move, Spassky takes the chance to pounce. And what he's going to do now is he's going to try to start threatening piece sacks on e3 to devastate the king in the center. He's also going to try and prevent the king from ever having enough time to castle queenside now. So knight to g4. In the game, Larsen plays g3 to stop queen h4. Okay. But I'm going to mention 2 things about this position. A, if Larsen traded off that knight, he will never be able to castle queenside because he will never be able to regain control of this diagonal here. Okay? That's display A. You are never evacuating the king now. You've got the pawns on the dark squares, the opponent's bishop on the light squares. Your king cannot get out anymore. And where are the white pieces? There's not a lot of white pieces on the king side. That's the other thing I failed to mention, and I apologize for this, on the previous move when we talked about here which side white should castle towards. On the king side, you've got 1 minor piece. On the queen side, you've got 2 minor pieces and a queen. It's a fairly major difference, and if the center is sort of cut off by these e4, e3 blocked pawns, that's another reason to put your king on the side of the board with your pieces. Don't send him all alone to the other corner and hope your opponent doesn't notice he's over there. Okay, knight to g4. So bishop g4, bishop g4. This position is just going to be bad with the king cut off. I don't need to give you any variations. I've analyzed a ton of them. I'm just going to skip over them, okay? This position's bad because the king can't get away. There's also queen h4 threatened, so you have to play another bad move like g3 or h4 here, and things just keep going from bad to worse, okay? The other idea I want to suggest for white here, other than taking on g4, is I just want to show you what if white castles now. Because this may have been Larsen's idea. If we're trying to guess why did he play f4, maybe so he could castle and have a space advantage where he castles. And he thinks this is going to make it hard for black to come fight him on this side of the board. He's got the bishop pressuring here and the plan of h3, g4 himself, sort of steamrolling the black minor pieces and taking up a bunch of space and weakening the e4 pawn by kicking the 2 pieces highlighted in red that have been defending this pawn. Okay? But here's how bad his situation is here. Spassky has an obliterating knockout right here. Black can end the game. Now, if black played h5, h4, h3, that would also be a good plan here. Nothing wrong with black's position there. The h-pawn running forward is also going to stop these h3, g4 ideas from ever really working out. It's going to keep the black pieces stable. You want your pieces to have stable squares, right? So look at this. These pieces cannot be unseated because of the restraining power of that h-pawn, right? Good work, h-pawn. That way you can be confident that your pieces can stay here if you want them. You can be confident that your e-pawn is going to have defenders. You've got that stability. Thank you, h-pawn, okay? But it's unnecessary because here it's time to just tee off on Larsen. And if you see the rest of this game, you'll know that Spassky was in the mood. I guarantee he would have delivered right here with just rook takes d2, splat, annihilation in the middle of the board, undermining e3. It seems shocking that black doesn't have this rook out yet or an open file, but this move just devastates the king because it's in such a bad situation. If queen d2, bishop e3 wins the queen, so that's not an option. So we want to develop the knight, right? But now knight takes e3, hitting the queen and setting up discovered check. Well, where can she go? Not here, okay? Not there, check. And so not d1 because the knight's on it. The queen's almost trapped. It's these 2 squares. By default, I would prefer not to be on the bishop's diagonal. So let's go queen c1, defending the knight and maybe some of these weak squares. Knight takes f1 check. Another surprise. Not to a total beginner who thinks, oh, rook's better than knight. But normally when you sack for an attack, and black sacked a whole rook, it's not to recover some material and just be like, oh, now I'm only down a knight. Because we're trading off our good attacking piece, right? The normal looking move here would be queen h4. It looks devastating, setting up knight g4 check, followed by queen h2 checkmate. And, you know, queen h4 is probably good. But I analyzed knight e3 first, and it wins, so that's what I'm going to show you. But normally you wouldn't think that you would trade off this knight. But here it works because check, the king's drawn out to recapture. White has to recapture or they're just down too much material. And then we play queen h4, threatening checkmate. Suddenly, we notice the king has just no squares. g3, queen takes h2 does not help at all, right? The queen's coming in. All these pawns are hanging as well. So something like queen e1 to defend the square, and then this queen comes in from here. And you can see that although black's attacking with basically 2 pieces, white's dead. That's how awkward their position is and how strong the e-pawn is. You know, no knight f3, no nothing. I mean, maybe you have to play knight f3 here, but you're obviously dead, right? Like in this kind of a position. Check. And mate. So queen h4 even before the rook sack might be good too, yeah. Sure. Queen h4 right here, threatening mate. And then if h3, you probably sack on d2 with the rook there and go for an attack. You probably have a good attack here. You could also play h5, defending the knight because they can't open the file. And then you go queen g3, forcing them to take your knight. But I think if you go queen h4, white can probably bail with this trade on g4. And the position's not as devastating as with my rook sacrifice. Right? Because white makes the trade, and now it's not cutting off the king. The king already got castled, and now we've got time maybe to either play queen e4 or knight c3, trying to get the knight here. I mean, I would guess black's position is still pleasantly better than white's, but it's not a full devastation yet, right? Whereas this move, rook d2, I've analyzed it. I've already showed you the variation. It's unequivocal death, right? Like, what are you supposed to do? The rook just explodes in your face. I mean, you're like sacking the queen or the king, right? That's basically the choice here. Kick the queen, take here with check. These are very surprising moves from black, but I thought of them and then I analyzed them and they worked. So, you know, sometimes if a really weird idea pops into your head, it's because there's some kind of strange reason why it makes sense there, even if formally you don't understand why it makes sense yet. And then if you look at it and it works out, it works out. So in this case, just a brutal and devastating attack immediately. The moment white castles kingside. Boom. That's an absolute destruction. So Larsen instead played g3 to keep the queen out of h4. And now here's the hook. And that's what Spassky needs to like ramp up the pressure even more, right? So you don't need to be asked twice here. You know what you want to do as black. If you're trying to memorize this game, if you're Boris Spassky, if you're playing solitaire chess, we're rushing this pawn here, trading this to open it up and go after this king before it can get castled. The other thing you can do if you want to is you can just sack on e3. I mean, I give you full permission to do this whenever you want. You can do that. You can sack with the bishop, put the knight on e3. I'm sure you'll be fine. But the thing is, right now, white's not threatening to get castled. If they ever castled, you'd even have knight f2 winning one of the rooks. So h5, developing a new piece, is, I think, more logical and strong than the sacrifice right now. The sacrifice is not a knockout. It's just playable. It's like you've got compensation. You've got play. You can do it if you really, really want to. But throw this pawn, get the rook into the game. Yeah. Now, if white allows h4, the game's sort of busted, right? Like, we play h4 for black. Now it's too late to play h3 because your rook's hanging on the file and it's pinned. So black's threatening to take. If you castle queenside, knight f2 wins one of your rooks. Maybe that's the best you can do. If you take here, the queen comes here and you're finished. So h4 just piles on more pressure than white can handle in one move. So you need to understand this is a direct threat to basically end the game at a you know, super GM level, right? Spassky is a world champion at the time this game is played, right? And Larsen is a candidate. So this is the top level players. So, you know, if they get a certain advantage, that's game over. They're just running with it. So h4, that's a direct threat to crush this game. So white plays h3, hoping to kick the knight back. And once you've played h3, then you've avoided destruction in a sense, because anytime black plays h4, you want to play g4 and keep the position closed. I imagine all of you, to some extent, know the idea that if you're behind in development, if you're behind in the initiative, if your opponent's creating threats and trying to wail on you, the defending player wants to try and close the game, wants to avoid opening lines, right? And the attacker is trying to find some way to force something open and get something going, right? So h3 is designed to prevent black from opening up the game by trading the hook pawn, right? But Spassky says that's still a hook. I leave the knight hanging just as a blockader and play h4. Now you can't keep my rooks out of the game. And he's correct. And white, for all intents and purposes, has to take this knight, because what else are you going to do as white? Like, play knight c3 and let Spassky take this pawn for free? Right? And then put the knight on f2? So for all intents and purposes, you have to accept the piece and hope your opponent's really miscalculated at this kind of level. Now he takes, and this introduces a very strange back rank checkmate. So Larsen's going to avoid the rook trade because he doesn't have a reserve rook to take the role of this rook in protecting back rank checkmate. But let me just show you the idea of like a reserve. If we trade this rook recaptures. Spassky still has a rook on the h file. Spassky still has a rook to give back rank checkmate. Larsen no longer has a rook to counter that, right? So that's where trades favor whoever has the reserve. So Larsen does not want to trade off this piece. It's the only piece really dealing with these back rank mate issues. And let me just show you real quick that, like, you know, here knight c3, rook check. I want you to know just how grim this is. We don't even play g2 and get an extra queen probably. We'll probably just go bishop here, cutting off the king to make sure it's checkmate. Right? And then g2 when we can take on f1 and give checkmate. So, no trade. Larsen moves the rook away. Now, Spassky has sacked a piece and left this bishop hanging. What is he on about? Oh, sorry. Question from chat. What if he took a second piece here and just sacked the rook? Check. Here. Boom. And new queen with checkmate coming. Gets all the stuff back real fast then. Oh, sorry. I misinterpreted the question. It was to at least trade once and then grab this piece. So then we would get check here and here. The king hasn't played knight c3 yet, so it's not ready to escape. So g2, and we're going to take and make a queen with mate. I don't really see moves that avoid this fate, right? Like here, queen, here, mate. All right, so back to the game. Remember, black plays h5, threatening h4. White tries to parry it by kicking the knight. Spassky just leaves the knight hanging, advances, sacks the knight, takes, opening the file. Larsen says, no, I need this rook. But now what are you going to do? Your bishop's hanging. I avoided the file. You've got a random g-pawn dangling here. Where is black's attack? Where is black's attack? Here it is, boy! Rook h1. This is a move which you could be forgiven for missing, even if you're a candidate for the world championship and your opponent sacked a piece and they're the world champion, and you're like, there must be some reason why they sacked the piece. I don't know. I'll take the piece and, oh no, rook h1. You know, it's possible Larsen didn't quite see this coming, but one of the filthiest moves in all of chess history. Yes, just insane. Just straight up hanging the rook and the h-file, by the way, right? Like, wait, how do you get the h-file after you sack the rook? This is one of the most amazing concepts in chess, where it's like, even once you know the concept, you look at it and you're like, maybe I've got the position wrong. Maybe this doesn't quite work. For me, this is like the Reti king and pawn endgame idea, where the king on h8 catches a pawn on h5. When I set up that endgame study, for a second, I'm always like, did I get this right? That pawn's a little bit too far. I must have set this up slightly wrong. Like, even once you know the idea, you're like, no, maybe I got the position slightly wrong, right? Did I memorize this game correctly? You know, maybe he's already played bishop takes g4, and so there's some like extra cutting off of the king already going on, or maybe this rook's already, maybe there's something. No, he just straight up sacks the rook, and the idea is simply that after rook takes g2, threatening the rook and queening is going to recapture the h-file. So the rook's going to have to move away. You can't allow pawn takes rook equals queen check, right? So the rook's going to have to move away. And then Spassky has access to queen h4 and rook h8, h1, and all those kinds of things. So he sacks the whole rook, seemingly losing the h-file, but he's just doing it for tempo. He sacks the rook, hits the tempo that white can't allow, rook to f1, and then queen h4 check. And now he's using the h-file, right? King went to d1. He takes, check. Bishop takes, check. And I think white resigned here, but it's only one more move to checkmate. So let's just show that bishop e2, queen h1 is checkmate. And king c1, queen e1 is going to lead to checkmate. Okay, do you guys see the idea of rook h1? We're going to cover this move in a second, but do you guys see the idea of the rook h1 sack? We're using the energy of this seemingly randomly scattered dead g-pawn. We're using its energy to gain a tempo. Rook sack, pawn move, just to get the queen to h4. It's so powerful. Any black rook or queen on the h-file coming to h1 is going to win the game. If rook h8 were check, it would win the game just as well as queen h4. Just rook h8 to h1 probably would probably work just as well as queen h4. But it's the tempo, right? We need white responding, and then we're coming through and giving the back rank mate. So that is rook h1. Oof. Tempo with the g-pawn, and then the devastation. Now, one more variation for completeness for folks who want to understand everything about it, right? Why did the rook go to a square where the pawn could take it instead of just going to the safe square where it blocks this pawn? Well, you guys know the next move that black's going to play, right? In a sense, instead of asking you guys to memorize these games, I'm asking you to understand them so you could just find the moves all over again, right? You're not repeating a move you don't know. You're not reciting digits of pi, right? 3.14159265335, right? You are just, you understand the idea so you can recreate, you can come up with the moves anew for yourself on each move, right? We're bringing the queen to the h-file with tempo, right? Checking that king. King moves. Now let's break the blockade and checkmate on the back rank. Oh, sacking the queen, but it's just logical, right? We're just breaking through. And that's why the rook's on f1 instead of g1 in the game, was because on g1 it would be undefended here. But it's all the same, right? If takes, we're going to have a checkmate in a second. Boom. Or we could say, okay, we've lost this square. Let's get out of the way with the king, right? Now we'll take, and get a new queen, right? And black will eventually win. All right. You guys think you can remember the move rook h1 here? It's not easy to do, but at the same time, it is the kind of move that can sear itself into your brain. I'm going to play through the whole game one more time for you, but then you're on your own to play through it a few times yourself. Come back to it next week, see if you still remember it. Teach it to a friend. That's what I always suggest at the end of every one of these videos, but I'm just going to keep repeating myself because I think sometimes y'all don't hear me. I'm very, very serious about this. It is very, very helpful for your chess knowledge to pass it on to other people. When you take something that you've learned and teach it to somebody else, that helps a huge percentage of people to actually store and keep that knowledge for themselves in the future. Okay? So take this game that you've learned and memorized and go show it to somebody else. You could teach it to them and explain the moves. You could even just pass it on, just show it to somebody just for fun, right? Just as a short. You don't have to explain everything. Just look at this move, boom. Okay? And that is how you hold on to the knowledge yourself, is by passing it on. All right, so Larsen's opening, right? Spassky blocks him in the center with the e-pawn. Now he's going to cut off this d5 move because he wants to play knight f3 and challenge this pawn. But he doesn't want this, folks. He doesn't want the pawn to get defended like that, right? So b3, e5, hits it, stops the d-pawn. Spassky's just most obvious developing move, every move, right? Oh, my pawn's attacked, I'll move it. Knight here, complicated, weird stuff, whatever. Most obvious developing move, boom, in the center. Takes it, well, I want to develop in the center. Boom, takes it. e3. Right here, you may not know if it was bishop f5 or queen e7. I don't care which order you play it in, but boom, most obvious. Brings out the bishop. Queen c2. Queen e7. Should have kept going with the queen side, Larsen. That would have avoided the full debacle and deprived the world of rook h1. But he plays bishop e2. He's maybe still thinking about castling kingside. I don't think he should, but maybe he does. Here he plays a terrible move, f4, and that is the red flag for Spassky. He says, okay, I've got my license to style now, right? And he starts styling. Knight to g4, going on the aggressive. Up to this point, developing one piece per move, only moving center pawns, putting pieces in the center, right? But now f4, waves the red flag. Spassky comes for him. Knight g4, introducing queen h4 check, and sacks on e3, and even on d2, as I've shown you, folks. g3 to block out the queen from h4, and now you've got the hook, and it's time to get to the main event, which is going to be one of the most dramatic prying open of the h-file in all of chess history. h5, threatening h4. Okay, the pawn is not only a hook, it's a blockaded hook. We can't move it. We got to get that knight out of the way. The knight is not moving, my friend. Takes the knight, takes the file. Avoids the trade because there's no backup, right? It's all on this rook's shoulders. Insert whatever scream you want right here, folks. Blah! Rook h1. Oh, it never gets old, does it? Okay, the rook went to f1. It could have also gone to g1. You guys are trying to memorize the game. I don't care if you remember rook f1 or rook g1 for Larsen. I want you to know how to win for black on either move and be able to reconstruct both the game with rook f1, queen h4, and the variation with rook g1, queen h4, okay? You just need to understand this game. You need to learn the idea from it. We're coming with the queen after this rook has to move. Rook f1. Check. King here. Takes. Takes back. Bishop g4, clearing the way for queen e1 or queen h1. Ring him up. Ring him up. That's where Spassky sends Larsen over to the cashier. Ring him up. How much do you have to pay for this lesson? It was a quick lesson, but a valuable one. Ding, 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 ding. We ring up Larsen. Spassky takes it, and that is your game to memorize. I hope you've got it. I hope you've got it. And I hope that one day in your life you will get to play a random piece sack onto just an open square like this. Just some splatting move. Just one time in your life to have that feeling of just throwing your piece. Bam. Take care, everybody. Have a great day.